There are two ways to destroy a person. The first is a single catastrophic event. A car crash. A sudden diagnosis. An act of violence. It's loud, it's messy, and it leaves scars everyone can see. It's trauma, but it's an honest trauma. It has a beginning and an end. The second way is quieter. It's a slow, methodical erosion. A dripping tap that wears away stone. You don't even notice it's happening until you look down one day and realize you're nothing but dust. The second way is a masterpiece of art and science. And my husband, he was a master. Before Daniel, my life was legible. It made sense. You could read it like a chart. Emily Clark, 29 years old, ER nurse. Vitals, stable. I worked 12-hour shifts in the controlled chaos of the emergency room at St. Jude's, and I was good at it. More than good. I was the one they called for a difficult IV stick on a dehydrated patient, the one whose hands never shook when we were cracking a chest. I thrived in the noise, the pressure, the constant triage of life and death. Because underneath the chaos, there was a system, an algorithm of care, ABC, airway, breathing, circulation. You follow the steps, you trust your training, and you bring order to the brink of collapse. My life was like that, ordered. My apartment was my decompression chamber, my sanctuary. It wasn't the cold, minimalist box you see now. It was warm, alive. I had plants everywhere. Ferns in the bathroom, a giant fiddle leaf fig in the corner that I talked to, succulents lining the windowsill. The air always smelled of lavender and clean linen. It was the place I came back to after a long shift, after holding the hand of a dying man or calming a terrified child. I'd kick off my shoes, water my plants, and feel the world settle back onto its axis. I was a person who fixed things. Broken bones, lacerations, arrhythmias. That was my job. But it was also who I was. I believed with a deep, almost religious certainty that everything broken could be mended. You just had to find the right treatment. I had friends. Good friends, the kind you make in the trenches. We'd seen the worst of humanity together, and the best of it. We'd go for drinks after a brutal shift and talk in a gallows humor shorthand that no one else could understand. My life had a trajectory. I was studying to become a nurse practitioner. I had a 5-year plan. I had a fundamental belief in the quiet goodness of most people, because I saw it every day. I saw strangers comforting each other in the waiting room. I saw the relief in a mother's eyes when I told her son was going to be okay. The world to me was a series of solvable problems. All it took was skill, patience, and a little bit of compassion. That was the person I was, strong, capable, clear. And then I met Daniel. He was a masterpiece of curated charisma. We met at a fundraiser for the hospital. He wasn't a doctor. He ran some kind of niche consultancy firm from home, something vague and intellectual to do with market psychology. He was 35, handsome in a way that wasn't immediately obvious. It was in his posture, the way he listened with his whole body when you spoke. He had this gentle, wounded quality about him, a man who seemed to have been through a storm and was just now learning to stand in the sun again. He told me about his first marriage on our 3rd date. He didn't want to, he said. He sighed this deep, noble sigh and said he hated to bring such ugliness into something so new and hopeful, but he believed in honesty. He told me about Sarah, his ex-wife. The word he used most often was unhinged. He painted her in these vivid, terrifying strokes. She was paranoid, he said, prone to screaming fits over nothing. She'd accuse him of having affairs if he was 10 minutes late from the grocery store. She threw a laptop at his head once, he said, showing me a faint, almost invisible scar above his eyebrow. He had emails, text messages, a whole library of evidence documenting her supposed instability. He would read them to me sometimes, his voice trembling with the memory of it. "Where are you?" "I know you're with her." "I'll kill myself, Daniel. I swear I will. And it will be your fault." Another one. "You think you can hide your money from me? I will burn this house to the ground with you in it." They were horrifying. And I, the healer, the fixer, felt this overwhelming wave of empathy. This poor man, this gentle soul who had endured so much. My entire professional training, my entire personality, is geared toward identifying pain and alleviating it. And here was a man whose pain was so palpable, so exquisitely detailed. I fell in love with the survivor. I fell in love with the man who had walked through fire and still knew how to be gentle. I didn't just fall in love with him. I felt a duty to him, a duty to be his peace, his safe harbor after the storm. Safe harbor. God. The language he used was always so poetic, so scripted. He needed to be the protagonist of a grand dramatic story. He couldn't just have a difficult divorce. It had to be an escape from a psychopath. He wasn't just a consultant. He was a lone genius navigating a corrupt corporate world. His whole life was a performance, and he was the writer, director, and star. I just didn't realize I wasn't his co-star. I was a prop. We got married a year later. A small, perfect ceremony in a historic courthouse. My friends from the hospital adored him. He was so attentive, so supportive of my demanding career. He'd have a hot meal and a glass of wine waiting for me when I got home from a shift that had gone into overtime. He'd listen for hours as I downloaded the day's trauma, rubbing my feet, telling me I was a hero. He learned the names of my colleagues. He remembered the details of my most difficult cases. He integrated himself into my life with the seamless, silent precision of a virus. Our home became his stage. He convinced me to get rid of my plants. They were messy, he said. They attracted bugs. He helped me redecorate, swapping my warm, comfortable clutter for clean lines, polished concrete floors, and stark, gallery white walls. He called it sophisticated minimalism, a clean space for a clean start. Looking back, I see it for what it was. He was sterilizing my environment, wiping away my identity one fern at a time until the only thing left in the space was him. And me, his reflection, the gaslighting. It was so subtle at first, I didn't even recognize it. And I'm a trained medical professional. I know the signs of psychological distress. But he was a virtuoso. He didn't attack my sanity. He affirmed my stress. When I'd forget something minor, he wouldn't say, "You're so forgetful." He'd wrap his arms around me and say, "Honey, you're working too hard. The things you see every day, of course it's affecting your memory. Maybe you should think about cutting back your hours." He was positioning himself as my caregiver, my protector. He was diagnosing me with the side effects of my own competence. He continued to feed me the narrative of Sarah, the crazy ex. Every few months there would be a new incident. A hysterical email she'd sent to his work account. A rambling late-night voicemail. He'd play them for me, his face a mask of weary resignation. "See?" he'd whisper. "This is what I was dealing with. This is why I'm so grateful for you, Emily, for your calm, for your stability." He was using this phantom woman to condition me. Every story about her madness was an implicit instruction on how I should behave. Be calm. Be stable. Don't be Sarah. My empathy was the cage, and his stories were the lock. He had weaponized my best quality against me, turning my compassion into a tool of my own confinement. I was so busy taking care of him, I didn't notice I was the one in critical condition. The day it all shattered. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. There was no screaming, no thrown laptop. The end of my world happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in October. My shift ended early, a minor miracle, and I decided to go home and surprise him. I remember walking up to our condo, feeling happy, feeling light. I was thinking about what we'd have for dinner. I put my key in the lock and turned it as quietly as I could. I was going to sneak up behind him at his desk and kiss his neck. The first thing I noticed was the sound. Voices from the living room. A woman's voice, soft and happy, and Daniel's, low and soothing. My first thought, the conditioned thought, was that it was a client. But then I heard her laugh, a sound that was bright and genuine. And I heard him say, "I've waited so long to do this." I took off my shoes and crept down the hallway. Our minimalist open-plan condo suddenly felt like a labyrinth. The white walls seemed to press in on me. I peeked around the corner of the entryway. And there he was, Daniel. In the center of our living room, the living room I paid for, on one knee. And before him stood a woman. She was pretty, with dark curly hair, and she was crying. Tears of joy. And on her finger, Daniel was sliding a ring onto her finger, but it wasn't just any ring. It was my grandmother's ring, a small antique sapphire. I had shown it to him months ago, told him the story of how my grandfather had saved for a year to buy it. I told Daniel I wanted to wear it one day. He'd held it in his palm, told me it was beautiful, too beautiful for just any day. He said we should save it. For a special anniversary, 10 years maybe, a symbol of our enduring love. And he was giving it to her. I felt the air leave my lungs. My medical brain took over. Patient is unresponsive, pupils dilated, signs of acute shock. But then I saw her face clearly, the woman crying tears of joy, and I recognized her, not from real life, but from the single grainy photograph Daniel had shown me once, from the depths of his trauma, the photo he'd used to put a face to the monster in his stories. It was Sarah. In that single silent moment, the entire architecture of my life collapsed. It wasn't about the affair. It was so much bigger than that. It was the realization that nothing was real. The stories, the texts, the voicemails, the scar above his eyebrow, all of it, a fabrication. A script. He hadn't escaped a monster. He had created one in his narrative to manipulate me, and in the real world, he had been trying to win her back the entire time. I wasn't his safe harbor. I was his alibi. I was the stable, respectable nurse he could use as a cover story, the perfect contrast to the unhinged woman he was secretly pursuing. He wasn't proposing to her out of love. He was recasting his favorite actress. He had finally convinced her to come back, to rejoin his twisted little drama, and he was giving her my grandmother's ring as a signing bonus. My history, my family's legacy, was just another prop for his stage. I backed away. I didn't make a sound. I slipped out of the apartment as quietly as I'd entered. I walked down the street in a daze. I remember the sky was this brilliant, indifferent blue. I sat on a park bench and watched children playing on a swing set, their laughter sounding like it was coming from another planet. The world hadn't changed, but I had been ripped out of it. It wasn't just that he had lied to me. It was that he had taken my most fundamental trait, my instinct to heal, my empathy, and he had turned it into a poison. He had diagnosed my compassion as a weakness and exploited it to perfection. I didn't just lose a husband. I lost my own mind. I lost my sense of self. The person I was before Daniel? She died in that hallway. She bled out on the polished concrete floor, and nobody even called a code. I went to a hotel. For 2 days, I just existed. I ordered room service I didn't eat. I stared at the television without seeing it. I was trying to process the trauma, trying to triage my own psyche. Airway, breathing, circulation. But my airway was clogged with lies. I couldn't breathe for the rage. And my heart had stopped. My first rational thought was, justice. I'll call a lawyer. I'll file for divorce. I'll expose him. And then, with a soul-crushing clarity, I realized I couldn't. What would I tell them? What would be my complaint? My husband is a pathological liar who methodically manipulated me for 2 years? That's not a crime. There's no statute for the murder of a personality. There's no evidence for a crime scene that only exists in your own head. Daniel was too smart for that. He was insulated. He had spent 2 years curating our social circle, our entire world around his narrative. To our friends, he was the devoted husband, and I was the high-strung ER nurse who was under a lot of stress. He'd been planting those seeds from the very beginning. If I went public, he would simply pivot his story. He wouldn't be the villain. He would be the heartbroken hero, forced to cope with his beloved wife's sudden and tragic mental breakdown. He'd use my profession against me. "She's suffering from vicarious trauma," he'd say, his voice filled with practiced concern. "She's projecting the horrors she sees at work onto our marriage. She needs help. He would have doctors, friends, everyone, lining up to attest to his devotion and my fragility. He had already written the script for my character assassination. He would gaslight the entire world on my behalf. The system couldn't touch him. The law cannot prosecute a ghost, and Daniel's true self was a ghost. He left no fingerprints on the psychological wreckage he created. He was untouchable, and in that hotel room, on the third day, as the sun came up, a new kind of clarity washed over me. It was cold. It was hard. It was the kind of clarity you get right before you intubate a patient. The time for sentiment is over. You have to be precise. You have to be clinical. If the system couldn't give me justice, then I would have to create my own. If the law couldn't see his crimes, I would have to become the instrument of a different kind of judgment. He had erased me. Fine. I would become a ghost, too. My own ghost. The one that would haunt him. He thought he was the writer and the director? He had no idea what a truly motivated artist could do. He wanted to push me to the brink of insanity? Well, you can't push a person off a cliff they've already learned to fly from. I work at the brink. I live there. The ER is a revolving door of humanity's worst moments, and I am the one who stands in the doorway and decides who comes back through. I have brought people back from the dead. I have held the line when everything was chaos. And I realized that every single skill I had honed in that emergency room, my ability to stay calm under pressure, my intimate knowledge of the human body's frailties, my knack for finding a vein in the dark, my comfort with life and death, could be repurposed. He made me his patient. He diagnosed me. He treated me. He confined me. It was time for a second opinion. It was my turn to play doctor. My first step was to go back home. I walked back into that apartment, my sanctuary that he had turned into a sterile operating theater. He was frantic, of course. Said he'd been calling me for 2 days, worried sick. He'd concocted a story about a family emergency, that the woman I'd seen was his cousin, that the ring was a family heirloom she was taking to be appraised. The lies flowed from him like blood from a severed artery. They were sloppy, desperate. He was a bad actor when he was off script. I didn't fight. I didn't scream. I played the part he had written for me. I cried. I told him he was right. I was just stressed from work. I was exhausted. I'd overreacted. I let him comfort me. I let him hold me. And as his arms were around me, as he was whispering his poison reassurances into my ear, I felt nothing. No love, no hate. Just the cold, calm focus of a surgeon before the first incision. The old Emily was dead. The fixer was gone. The healer had hung up her coat. In her place was something new, something he had created. An architect. My revenge wouldn't be loud or messy. It wouldn't be a single, catastrophic event. It would be quiet. It would be methodical. It would be a slow, precise erosion of his reality. I wasn't going to destroy his life. I was going to deconstruct his mind. I was going to use my knowledge, my skills, my access, to turn his own tactics back on him. I was going to gaslight the gaslighter. I would be his caregiver, his loving wife, all while I systematically dismantled his psyche, piece by piece, until he couldn't tell the difference between his fictions and my reality. He wanted a drama. I was going to give him a clinical trial. He was the subject, and the only variable was me. That night, after he fell asleep, I took out my laptop. I didn't look for lawyers. I didn't look for divorce papers. I started with a single Google search. It was a name. Sarah Jensen. His ex-wife. The monster from his stories. The star of his new show. I had a feeling she and I had a lot to talk about. The first rule of treating a complex trauma is to get a full patient history. And I was just getting started. The diagnosis was narcissistic personality disorder with sociopathic tendencies. The prognosis was poor, but the treatment was going to be fascinating. Of course, here is the recap of Act 1 and the full text of Act 2. Emily. So, let's review the chart. Patient presented as a competent, stable individual, with a baseline belief in the fundamental order of the world, an ER nurse, a fixer. She met a man, Daniel, who presented as a survivor, a gentle soul wounded by a past trauma, a narrative he meticulously constructed around his unhinged ex-wife, Sarah. For 2 years, my patient, let's call her the old Emily, dedicated herself to being his caregiver, his safe harbor. Her defining characteristic, empathy, was identified and systematically weaponized against her. The inciting incident was nonviolent. It was the discovery that the entire diagnosis was a fabrication. Daniel wasn't a survivor, he was a predator. Sarah wasn't a monster, she was his ongoing project. And the old Emily wasn't his partner, she was his cover. The trauma resulted in a complete psychotic break with her own identity. The self she knew died that day. When conventional treatments, like the justice system, proved ineffective against a pathogen as insidious as Daniel, the patient underwent a transformation. The healer persona was shed, replaced by a new operating protocol. She resolved to treat his pathology not by fixing it, but by mirroring it. To cure the disease, she had to become the disease. The objective shifted from recovery to revenge. Cold clinical deconstruction of the man who had erased her. The initial step in this new treatment plan was simple: gather data. And that began with finding the first victim he'd left in his wake. It began with Sarah. Finding Sarah Jensen wasn't difficult. We live in an age where everyone leaves a digital trail. A few hours of focused, methodical searching, and I had it. Her social media was private, but her professional profile on a networking site was public. She was a graphic designer. She looked normal. Happy, even. There was a photo of her with a golden retriever, smiling a genuine, unguarded smile. It was the face of a woman who had survived something and come out the other side, not the face of the raving lunatic from Daniel's stories. For a moment, a pang of something, jealousy maybe, shot through me. She had escaped. She was free. I was still trapped in the wreckage. I pushed the feeling down. It was an unproductive emotional response. Sentiment was a luxury I could no longer afford. Contacting her was the critical part. A direct approach was too risky. Daniel had spent years poisoning her against the world, painting himself as the victim. If he had ever mentioned me, it was likely as his new, stable, perfect partner. A direct call from me would seem like a threat, a trap. I needed a sterile approach. I drafted the email a dozen times. It had to be precise, professional, and intriguing enough to warrant a response without being alarming. I posed as a researcher from a fictional market research group. The subject line was bland. Query regarding a former colleague. The body of the email was a work of artful misdirection. I wrote that our firm was conducting a confidential background assessment for a potential senior partner position. The candidate, Daniel Carter, had listed her as a reference from a period of his life where he'd done some freelance work. Could she possibly spare 15 minutes for a brief, confidential phone call to discuss her professional impressions of him? I salted it with just enough corporate jargon to sound legitimate. I gave no name, only a title, lead researcher, and I provided a burner phone number. I hit send and felt my heart, a muscle I thought had ceased to function, thump once, hard, against my ribs. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in controlled patience. I went to work, I charted, I triaged, I cleaned wounds. I moved through my shifts like an automaton, the background anxiety a low, constant hum. I played my part at home. I made Daniel dinner. I asked about his day. He was still in his attentive, loving husband mode. The phase after my supposed breakdown. He was cloyingly sweet, a man performing penance for a sin he hadn't actually committed, which was, in its own way, the most honest thing he'd ever done. He was on his best behavior, which made my work so much easier. On the third day, my burner phone buzzed. An unknown number. I walked into the bathroom, turned on the shower to mask the sound, and answered. "This is Emily." I'd decided at the last minute to use my own name. Anonymity felt like a lie, and my entire mission was now about a radical, weaponized form of truth. Her voice on the other end was hesitant, cautious. "Hi, this is Sarah Jensen. I got your email. Thank you for calling back. Ms. Jensen, I appreciate your time." I kept my tone level, detached. "To be honest," she said, and I could hear the tension in her voice, "I was surprised to hear from anyone about Daniel, especially professionally. We haven't spoken in years." Here it was. The first incision. "I understand this might be unusual. Our client is considering him for a position of significant trust. We're just doing our due diligence. Anything you can tell me about his character, his reliability, his integrity would be invaluable." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head, the years of conditioning warring with her curiosity. Finally, she let out a dry, humorless laugh. "His integrity? You're calling me for a reference on Daniel Carter's integrity? Is there an issue?" I asked, my voice betraying nothing. "An issue?" She laughed again, louder this time. "Honey, you haven't just called the wrong number, you've called the wrong solar system. Let me guess, he told you I was crazy, right? Unhinged? Paranoid?" The words hit me like a bag of saline, cold and sharp. "That's the general impression, yes." "Of course it is," she sighed. "Look, I don't know who you are, or if this job is even real, but let me give you your reference. Daniel Carter is a black hole in a bespoke suit. He doesn't have a character. He has a script. He doesn't have relationships. He has a cast. And if you get in his way, or if you stop playing your part, he won't just fire you. He'll burn the whole theater down and stand outside telling everyone you were the one playing with matches. Do your client a favor. Run." My breath hitched. It was like listening to a ghost describe my own haunting. "He's still doing it then," I said, and my voice faltered, the clinical detachment cracking for just a second. There was another pause. "Wait," she said, her tone shifting from bitter to suspicious. "What do you mean, still? Who is this? This isn't about a job, is it?" I took a deep breath. "No," I said. "It's not. My name is Emily Clark. I'm an ER nurse at St. Jude's, and for the last 2 years I've been Daniel's wife." The silence that followed was so profound I thought she'd hung up. Then, a small broken sound. A sob quickly stifled. "Oh God," she whispered. "You're the new one. He told me he'd found someone stable. Someone who understood him." "He did," I said, my voice hardening again. "He found someone who understands him perfectly now. Sarah, I think you and I need to talk, and I think you need to tell me everything." We met 2 days later, in a noisy, anonymous coffee shop halfway between our two worlds. Seeing her in person was surreal. She was vibrant, funny, with a sharp, self-deprecating wit. She was everything he wasn't. She was real. For 3 hours, she laid out the blueprint of Daniel's pathology. It was my life, just with a different female lead. The love bombing, the subtle isolation from her friends, the creation of a shared us against the world narrative. And then the gaslighting. The stories he told her about his ex-girlfriend before her. The way he twisted her own anxieties and used them as proof of her instability, and then she gave me the ammunition. The intimate details. The memories that were exclusively theirs. The things that had never made it into the script he'd fed me. A terrible, off-key song he used to sing to her when he thought he was being romantic. The cheap, gardenia-scented perfume she wore on their first date, which he'd claimed to love. The obscure book of poetry he'd given her, with a specific, deeply personal inscription on the inside cover. A recurring nightmare he had about being trapped in a house with no doors. She talked, and I listened. I didn't take notes. I'm trained to memorize details under pressure. I cataloged it all in my head, creating a patient file. Subject: psychological triggers. Auditory, olfactory, literary. Known phobias: claustrophobia, failure. When she was done, she looked exhausted, but also lighter. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her eyes searching my face. "I'm going to conduct an experiment," I said. I'm going to introduce a series of controlled stimuli into his environment to see if a subject's manufactured reality can be systematically dismantled. She stared at me. You're going to mess with his head. I'm going to treat his condition, I corrected her gently. He built a world of ghosts and shadows for you and for me. I'm just going to give him a few of his own. She was hesitant at first. She was out. She was free. Why get dragged back in? Because he's still out there, I told her. He's going to do this again to someone else. And someone else after that. He's a contagion. And I'm the only one in a position to administer the cure. I think it was the clinical certainty in my voice that convinced her. She wasn't agreeing to revenge. She was agreeing to a quarantine. She gave me her old bottle of gardenia perfume, the last dregs of it still in the bottom, and a copy of the poetry book. Be careful, Emily, was the last thing she said to me. He's a cornered animal when his story starts to fall apart. I know, I said. I work with cornered animals every day. The treatment began the following week. Phase 1, environmental manipulation. The goal was simple, to introduce elements into his sterile, controlled world that did not belong. Elements that only he would recognize, making him question his own senses. First, the auditory stimulus. I bought a tiny magnetic Bluetooth speaker, no bigger than a quarter. One evening, while he was on a conference call in his study, I slipped into our bedroom and attached it to the metal framework deep under the bed, completely out of sight. That night, as we were lying in the dark, I connected my phone. I'd found a recording of the song Sarah had told me about, a horribly off-key version sung by a college student on YouTube. I played it at the lowest possible volume. A tinny, barely there whisper of a melody. What's that? He whispered. What's what? I murmured, feigning sleepiness. That music, do you hear that? I listened dramatically. I don't hear anything, honey. It's just the wind. I rolled over and put my arm around him. Go back to sleep. He lay there rigid for almost an hour. I could feel the tension humming off him. The next morning he was irritable. He searched the room looking for the source. He found nothing. I did it again 3 nights later. And then a week after that, random intervals. Never enough to be a pattern, just enough to plant a seed of doubt. Was he hearing things? Next, the olfactory stimulus. The gardenia perfume. This was trickier. I couldn't just spray it. He'd notice. So I used my medical knowledge. I took a sterile cotton ball and applied a tiny amount of the perfume. Then, using tweezers, I carefully unzipped the back of the cushion on his favorite armchair in his study and tucked the cotton ball deep inside the foam. It was a slow-release system. The scent was imperceptible unless you were sitting there, immersed in it for hours. The first time he noticed, he came out of the study looking pale. This is going to sound crazy, he said, sniffing the air, but it smells like Sarah in there. I feigned a look of concern and went into the study. I made a show of sniffing the air dramatically. I don't smell anything, Daniel. Just books and that leather chair. Are you feeling okay? You've seemed really on edge lately. I'm not on edge, he snapped, a flicker of the anger he'd always attributed to Sarah. I know what I smell. Okay, honey, I said, my voice all soothing reason. I believe you. Maybe one of the neighbors is burning a weird candle or something. I was invalidating his reality while pretending to validate his feelings. Gaslighting 101. He'd been an excellent teacher. The book was the masterstroke. He was a creature of habit. Every night, he'd organize the papers on his desk into a neat pile, placing a heavy marble paperweight on top. One night, after he was asleep, I took the copy of the poetry book Sarah had given me and slid it under the pile of papers, so just the very edge of the spine was visible. It wasn't the exact same book he'd given her. This was a newer edition, but the title was the same. The next morning, I heard a sharp, indrawn breath from his study. I walked in holding 2 cups of coffee. He was staring at his desk, at the book, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the desk. What's wrong? I asked. He pointed a trembling finger. Where did that come from? I followed his gaze. Oh, that? I picked it up at a used bookstore last week. The cover looked interesting. I was going to read it. Why? He just stared at it, his face ashen. The odds of me, his wife, randomly buying the one specific obscure book of poetry he had once given to his ex. It was a statistical improbability, a coincidence so profound it felt like a message. It was a crack in the foundation of his rational world. "You bought that?" he stammered. "Yeah. Is it any good?" I asked, my voice light and breezy. He didn't answer. He just sank into his chair, the one that smelled faintly of his past, in a room where he sometimes heard music that wasn't there, and stared at a book that couldn't possibly be on his desk. Phase 1 was complete. The subject was exhibiting signs of mild paranoia and sensory confusion. It was time for Phase 2. Phase 2 was the physiological assault. This was my area of expertise. The human body is a delicate chemical balance, homeostasis. My goal was to systematically disrupt his, to create physical symptoms that would amplify his psychological distress. I would turn his own body into a haunted house. The protocol began with his coffee. Daniel was a coffee snob. He drank a specific single-origin Arabica bean. Arabica beans have a relatively low caffeine content. I went to a specialty store and bought a bag of pure Robusta beans from Vietnam, which have nearly double the caffeine concentration. They look almost identical. I emptied his bag and refilled it with the Robusta. The desired effect was immediate. "God, I feel so jittery today," he said a few days later, pacing the living room. "My heart is racing." I walked over and played the part of the concerned nurse. "Let me feel your pulse." I took his wrist, my fingers expertly finding the radial artery. I frowned. "It is a little fast. Tachycardic, about 110. Have you been under a lot of stress at work?" "No more than usual," he said, his eyes wide with worry. "What's wrong with me?" "It's probably nothing," I soothed. "Probably just anxiety. But we should keep an eye on it." Next, his sleep. I started making him health smoothies in the evening, full of kale, bananas, protein powder. He thought I was taking care of him. What he didn't know was that I was also blending in small amounts of things that disrupt the sleep cycle. A spoonful of aged Parmesan, a sliver of soy, foods rich in tyramine, an amino acid that triggers the release of norepinephrine. It's a neurotransmitter associated with the fight-or-flight response. Ingested before bed, it's known to inhibit REM sleep and cause intensely vivid nightmares. He started waking up in a cold sweat. He told me about the nightmares. Horrible, detailed dreams. He was trapped in our condo, but all the doors and windows were bricked over. He'd claw at the walls until his fingers bled. Sarah's recurring nightmare fed back to him through his own subconscious. I'd hold him, comfort him, tell him it was just stress. But I could see the toll it was taking. The dark circles under his eyes. The way his hands trembled when he thought I wasn't looking. The final piece was the headaches. This was more subtle. I noticed he took a daily multivitamin. I looked up the formulation. Then I went to the pharmacy and bought a bottle of high-dose niacin, vitamin B3. I emptied his vitamin capsules and refilled them with the niacin. In normal doses, it's harmless. In the high doses I was giving him, a common side effect is a flushing reaction and severe, persistent headaches. Combined with the high caffeine intake and the profound lack of quality sleep, it was a perfect storm of physiological misery. He was falling apart, and I was his sole caregiver. I was the one who took his blood pressure, which was now consistently elevated. I was the one who documented his symptoms in a little notebook, showing him the data, my face a mask of professional concern. "Look, Daniel, your heart rate is up, your sleep is disturbed, you're having headaches. I really think you should see Dr. Matthews and get a prescription for an anxiolytic." I was prescribing the diagnosis. He was so caught up in the physical symptoms I was creating. He didn't realize they were just the side effects of a much more aggressive treatment I was administering. He was becoming the person he had pretended. Sarah was irritable, paranoid, exhausted. He started lashing out. He accused me of moving his keys. He claimed I was making noises just to annoy him. Each time I responded with calm, loving, unshakable patience. "Honey, your keys are right here where you always leave them. I think your mind is just playing tricks on you. You're so tired." I was his rock, his anchor, and I was the one creating the storm. The midpoint revelation, the thing that complicated everything, didn't come from Daniel. It came from Sarah. We had maintained a cautious contact, a few texts here and there. She wanted to know if I was okay. One night, she called me, her voice strained. "I have to tell you something," she said. "It's about Daniel's family." Daniel's narrative about his family was a cornerstone of his persona. He came from old money, he claimed, but had been disowned. His father was a tyrannical monster, his mother a cold, social-climbing narcissist. He was the sensitive son who had escaped their toxic influence to make his own way in the world. It was a key part of his victimhood, another storm he had bravely weathered. "It's all a lie, Emily," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "All of it." I was cleaning out my garage and I found this old box of his stuff. Papers, things he'd left behind. His parents. They weren't monsters. They were just normal. They were high school teachers from Ohio. They died in a car crash when he was 22. I felt the floor drop out from under me. What? There's a life insurance payout statement in here? $100,000. That was his family money. And there's more. He didn't go to Princeton. He went to Ohio State for 2 years and dropped out. His whole backstory, the sophisticated, wounded intellectual from a wealthy family, it's a complete work of fiction. He's not just a liar, Emily. He's a ghost. He has no real past. I hung up the phone, my mind reeling. This changed everything. I thought I was taking revenge on a man. But Daniel Carter, the man I knew, the man I married, didn't actually exist. He was an empty vessel, a construct of lies built on a foundation of even bigger lies. Who was I even destroying? Could you murder a fictional character? The revelation didn't make me want to stop. It did the opposite. It erased any lingering trace of doubt, any microscopic speck of guilt. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about sanitation. It was about cleaning a wound. My target wasn't just a man who had hurt me. He was a void. A null set that was actively causing damage to the real world. My resolve hardened from steel to diamond. I wasn't just deconstructing his psyche for my own satisfaction. I was conducting a controlled demolition of a dangerously unstable structure before it could collapse and hurt anyone else. But as my resolve grew, so did his paranoia. And that led to my first major setback. He started talking about installing security cameras. Just for peace of mind, he said, trying to sound casual. With the weird smells and the noises, maybe someone has a key. We should be careful. My blood ran cold. Cameras would end everything. I would be caught. My entire carefully constructed experiment would be exposed. I had to pivot. I had to use his paranoia against itself. "Oh, Daniel, no," I said, my voice filled with a new kind of fear, one I was performing. "Cameras? In our home? It would feel like we were in a prison. I couldn't live like that. It would make my anxiety so much worse." I turned the tables. I made his solution a trigger for my supposed fragility. "If you're that scared, maybe we should move." I saw the flicker of panic in his eyes. Moving was the last thing he wanted. This condo was his castle, his stage. The thought of uprooting his entire performance was terrifying to him. I was betting that his need for control over his environment was stronger than his paranoia. No, he said quickly. "You're right. No cameras." It was a stupid idea. We're not moving. It was a close call, a reminder that my subject was unpredictable. I needed to escalate the treatment before he had another rational thought. The low point, the moment it almost all came crashing down, happened a week later. It was 3 a.m. I was woken by a gasp and then a thud. Daniel was on the floor next to the bed, clutching his chest. His face was slick with sweat, his eyes wild with terror. "I can't breathe," he wheezed. "My heart, it's..." Stopping. My training kicked in instantly, an override of the revenge protocol. Patient is diaphoretic, complaining of chest pain, shortness of breath. I dropped to my knees beside him. The architect of his ruin was gone and the ER nurse was back. "Daniel, look at me. Breathe with me." Slow, deep breaths. I checked his pulse. It was thready and incredibly fast, well over 150. A severe panic attack, amplified by the caffeine, exhaustion, and niacin. A full-blown sympathomimetic crisis of my own creation. "It hurts," he gasped. "I'm dying." "You're not dying," I said, my voice calm and authoritative, the voice I use when I'm stopping a bleed. "You're having a panic attack. It feels like you're dying, but you're not. I'm right here, but it was getting worse." His breathing grew more shallow, his lips started to turn blue. "Patient is becoming cyanotic. Airway is compromised. For a horrifying second, I saw it all flash before my eyes. The 911 call, the paramedics in my bedroom, the ER, the toxicology screen. They would find the caffeine, the niacin. They would find it all? My career, my life would be over. And I would be a murderer." His eyes rolled back in his head. His pulse vanished. He was in cardiac arrest. There was no time to think. There was only muscle memory. I tilted his head back, checked his airway. Nothing. I started compressions. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, hard and fast. The rhythm of it a grim mockery of a heartbeat. I was pumping his chest, trying to save the life of the man I was trying to systematically destroy. The irony was so profound it was almost nauseating. The two Emilys, the healer and the destroyer, were at war over his body on the bedroom floor. "Come on, Daniel," I grunted, the sweat dripping from my forehead. "Don't you dare do this. Was I trying to save him or was I trying to save myself? I don't know. Maybe there was no difference." After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute, he gave a great, shuddering gasp. His eyes fluttered open. Color flooded back into his face. His heart had restarted. He was breathing. He was alive. I collapsed next to him, my body shaking with adrenaline and a terror so absolute it left me hollow. I had almost killed him. I had almost crossed the line from psychological warfare to literal homicide. The experiment had almost gone catastrophically wrong. He lay there weeping, not from gratitude, but from sheer terror. And I held him. I held the man whose heart I had just restarted, and I stroked his hair, and I whispered soothing things. But inside I was ice and steel. The war was over. The healer had just fought her last battle, and she had lost. That moment of pure instinctual care, it was the last gasp of the old Emily. And as I held my weeping husband, I felt her die. I felt her let go. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that there was no line I wouldn't cross now. The low point wasn't that he almost died. The low point was that, when I brought him back, I wasn't relieved. I was disappointed. I had faced the abyss, and I hadn't blinked. The next day, he was a changed man. He was broken, terrified. He clung to me like a child. He told me I had saved his life. He called me his guardian angel. He agreed to see a psychiatrist. He agreed to take whatever medication they prescribed. He was utterly, completely dependent on me. He was finally the patient he had always pretended to be. And I was in total control. The preliminary treatment was complete. The subject was destabilized, sedated, and prepped for the final procedure. My near failure had become my greatest success. He was now a prisoner in his own mind, and I was the only one with the key. It was time to stop medicating the symptoms. It was time to go in and cut the cancer out. It was time for the confrontation. Phase 3 was about to begin. And it wouldn't end until he understood exactly who was the doctor and who was the disease. Let's finalize the case notes. After establishing contact with a previous victim, codenamed Sarah, a treatment protocol was initiated. The objective was the complete deconstruction of the subject's manufactured reality. The methodology involved a 2-phase psychological and physiological assault. Phase 1, environmental manipulation, introduced auditory and olfactory stimuli linked to the subject's suppressed past, inducing a baseline state of anxiety and sensory doubt. Phase 2, physiological assault, utilized my specific expertise to disrupt the subject's homeostasis. A controlled administration of high-caffeine Robusta beans, tyramine-rich food additives, and high-dose niacin successfully induced symptoms of tachycardia, severe sleep disruption, and chronic headaches. Throughout the treatment, I maintained the role of primary caregiver, a strategy that allowed me to monitor, document, and amplify the subject's psychological decline. A complication arose when new data, provided by Sarah, revealed the subject's entire personal history to be a work of fiction, a far more profound pathology than initially diagnosed. This confirmed the necessity of the treatment. The protocol reached a critical juncture when the subject experienced a full cardiac arrest, a direct result of the administered physiological stressors. I initiated emergency medical intervention, CPR, and successfully resuscitated the subject. This event, which could be classified as a near failure, paradoxically served as the treatment's most crucial turning point. It had two primary outcomes. First, it completely eradicated any residual empathic responses I held, excising the last remnants of my previous identity. The healer died in that moment. Second, it rendered the subject completely docile and psychologically dependent on me, his savior. He was, for all intents and purposes, broken. The patient was prepped. The operating theater was ready. It was time for the final procedure. The weeks following Daniel's cardiac event were quiet, eerily so. The man who had been a whirlwind of charismatic performances and subtle manipulations was now a ghost in his own home. He was subdued, pliant. He started the anxiolytics his new psychiatrist prescribed, and I made sure he took them every morning with his high-caffeine coffee. The medication blunted the edges of his panic, but it also made him suggestible, his mind wrapped in a dull, medicated fog. He moved through our condo like a patient in a recovery ward, speaking in low tones, his eyes constantly seeking me out for reassurance. I was his entire world. His guardian angel he'd called me. The irony was a constant, low-level hum in the back of my mind. My role as his caregiver was now absolute. I managed his prescriptions. I made his appointments. I spoke to his doctor. I told him with a straight face that Daniel was suffering from a severe anxiety disorder, likely genetic, triggered by work stress. Daniel, sitting beside me in the doctor's office, just nodded along, a puppet agreeing with the ventriloquist. He had ceded all control to me. It was the perfect, sterile environment for the final act. The confrontation I planned wasn't going to be a screaming match. It wasn't going to be a dramatic, tear-filled confession. That was his world, the world of cheap melodrama. My world was the world of evidence, of diagnosis, of cold, hard facts. I was going to hold a case conference, and he was going to be the subject, the audience, and the disease all at the same time. My preparations were meticulous. I spent an afternoon in a copy shop, making high-quality prints of the documents Sarah had given me. His parents' Ohio death certificates, looking stark and official. The life insurance statement, the $100,000 payout that had been the seed money for his reinvention. His transcript from Ohio State, 2 years of mediocre grades and a final, definitive withdrew. I arranged them in a neat manila folder. Evidence Exhibit A, the death of Daniel Carter's past. Then I gathered the other instruments. The half-empty bottle of gardenia perfume. The book of poetry. I went to the kitchen and took out the bag of Robusta coffee beans, the bottle of niacin capsules, a container of grated Parmesan cheese. I arranged them on our cold, minimalist coffee table like a surgeon laying out their tools before an operation. Each item was a piece of the story. Each was a scalpel I was about to use to carve him up. The final piece of the puzzle was the witness. He couldn't be allowed to reframe this later, to twist it into another story where he was the victim of my madness. The narrative had to be cauterized. It needed a second signature. I texted Sarah, "It's time. I need you to come over tomorrow at 7 p.m. Tell him you were in the neighborhood and wanted to finally meet his wife and bury the hatchet." He's too sedated and broken to refuse. She was scared. I could feel it through the phone. But she agreed. She knew, as I did, that this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about ensuring the contagion was neutralized for good. The next evening, the air in the condo was thick with unspoken tension. I had told Daniel an old friend was stopping by. He just nodded, passive. When the doorbell rang, I opened it to find Sarah, her face pale but her eyes resolute. I led her into the living room. Daniel looked up from the couch. When he saw her, his eyes widened, a flicker of the old, calculating Daniel trying to surface through the fog of medication. "Sarah, what? What are you doing here? Hello, Daniel, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. Sarah was just in the area, I said smoothly, closing the door behind her. She wanted to come by and say hello. Please, sit down. I directed them both to sit, Daniel on the couch, Sarah in the armchair opposite him, the one with the perfumed cotton ball still buried in its cushion. I remained standing. The doctor always stands. Daniel, I began, my voice calm and even. We're here today to discuss your case. He looked at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. My case? What are you talking about, Emily? Is this about my anxiety? In a way, I said. I've been doing a great deal of research into the root causes of your condition, and I think I've finally arrived at a diagnosis. I picked up the manila folder from the coffee table. I'd like to present my findings. I took out the first document. The death certificate for one Eleanor Carter. This is your mother, I believe, I said, placing it on the table in front of him. High school English teacher from Akron, Ohio. Died in a traffic accident on Route 8 when you were 22. Not a cold-hearted narcissist from Greenwich, Connecticut. I laid down the second one. And this is your father. David Carter, history teacher. Also died in the same accident. Not a tyrannical Wall Street monster? His face went slack. The color drained from it. He stared at the papers as if they were snakes. And this, I continued, placing the insurance statement next to them, is the old money you were disowned from. $100,000. A tragedy, to be sure, but not quite the dramatic backstory you've been dining out on. Finally, I added the transcript. Princeton, was it? Or was it 2 years at Ohio State before you dropped out? It's so hard to keep the story straight. He was speechless, his mouth opening and closing silently. He looked from the papers to me, then to Sarah, his eyes pleading. He was looking for an ally, for someone to help him rewrite the scene. But the entire cast was united against him. Who are you? He whispered, his voice a dry rasp. I'm the lead researcher on your case, I said, and I've been very thorough. I let the weight of his exposed life settle in the room for a moment. The silence was absolute. Then I moved to the next phase of the presentation. But the subject's history is only half the story, I said, my voice dropping to an almost conversational tone. The more interesting part is the treatment. I picked up the tiny Bluetooth speaker I'd retrieved from under the bed. You remember the music? The song you couldn't get out of your head? I turned it on, and the tinny, off-key melody filled the room for a few seconds before I turned it off. That was me. I picked up the bottle of gardenia perfume. And the smell of Sarah you couldn't explain? I gave a single sharp spritz into the air. The cloying scent filled the space. Also me. I could see the dawning horror in his eyes, the slow, terrifying calculus of realization, the heart palpitations. I held up the bag of Robusta beans. Switching your decaf level Arabica for this. A simple but effective intervention. The nightmares? The feeling of being trapped? I held up the small container of cheese. A little tyramine in your evening smoothie goes a long way to disrupting REM sleep. And the headaches? The flushing? I shook the bottle of niacin capsules. The rattling sound was unnaturally loud in the silent room. A vitamin supplement. Perfectly harmless, unless you know exactly how to combine it with caffeine and sleep deprivation to create a state of perpetual, low-grade agony. He stared at the items on the table, the evidence of my work, the instruments of his undoing. He was connecting every moment of terror, every phantom symptom, every paranoid thought from the last few months to me. His caregiver, his loving wife, his guardian angel, he stammered, his body starting to tremble. You did this to me. You made me sick. No, Daniel, I said, and my voice was devoid of all emotion. It was the voice of a final diagnosis. You were already sick. I just made the symptoms visible. I made the inside match the outside. You build your entire life on lies, Daniel. You create fictional worlds and force other people to live in them. You are a ghost. An absence. I just held up a mirror. It's not my fault you shattered. He looked at Sarah, his last desperate hope. Sarah, tell her. Tell her she's crazy. Sarah looked at him, not with hatred, but with a kind of weary, clinical pity. She's not crazy, Daniel. She's the most sane person in this room. She's just the first one who learned to speak your language. And with that, he broke. It wasn't a loud, dramatic snap. It was a quiet, total collapse. A sound escaped his throat, a high, thin wail of a child who has finally understood that there are no adults coming to save him. He curled into a ball on the couch, his hands over his head, and he began to sob. Not the performative, noble tears he was so good at, but the ugly, ragged, soul-empty sobs of a man who has been completely and irrevocably erased. The fictional character of Daniel Carter died right there on our minimalist sofa. All that was left was nothing. A hollow man from Ohio crying in a room he didn't own, surrounded by the wreckage of a life he had never really lived. Sarah and I didn't say a word. We just watched for a moment. My work was done. The procedure was a success. I walked to the front door and opened it. Sarah stood up and walked out without a backward glance. I took one last look at the scene. At the man on the couch, the props on the table, the sterile white walls of the operating theater. And then I walked out and closed the door behind me, leaving him there. I didn't take a single thing with me. There was nothing in that home that was mine anyway. That was 6 months ago. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that his landlord found him a week later. The place was a wreck. He was catatonic. He's in a long-term psychiatric facility now, somewhere upstate. Sometimes I wonder what story he's telling them in there. But then I realize it doesn't matter. Nobody is listening anymore. Sarah and I are not friends. We don't talk. Our alliance was a temporary, tactical one, born of a shared diagnosis. We cauterized a wound together. There's nothing more to be said. I wish her well. I hope she and her dog are happy. I live in a new apartment now. It's smaller. I moved across town, transferred to a different hospital. No one here knows my story. I'm just Emily Clark, the quiet, efficient nurse who's good at IVs. My life is legible again, and that leaves the final question. The one you've been waiting for. The post-operative assessment. Was it worth it? Did the revenge bring me peace? Peace is the wrong word. Peace is what I had before. It's a warm, living thing. You can't get that back by surgically excising a tumor. The surgery saves your life, but it leaves a scar. It leaves a phantom limb, a space where something used to be. The old Emily, the one who loved plants and believed in fixing things, is gone. I can't bring her back. The woman who took her place, the cold architect of revenge. She's gone now, too. Her work is done. I feel her absence like a quiet hum. So what am I now? I'm the scar. I'm the silence after the screaming stops. I don't feel joy, but I don't feel rage. I don't feel love, but I don't feel the agony of its betrayal. I feel equilibrium, a perfect flat, stable line on a heart monitor. Some people would call that emptiness. But after years of his noise and months of my own fury, this quiet, sterile, empty space feels like a victory. It wasn't about peace. It was about control. He took my reality from me, so I took his from him. The slate is clean now, wiped clean with bleach and fire, and in the quiet, in the emptiness, for the first time in a very long time, I get to decide what gets written next. He was a disease. I was the cure. But the thing they don't tell you about radical treatment is that it saves you, but it never ever leaves you whole. And you have to learn to live with being the one who survived.